The biggest mistake a bully can make in prison is picking the wrong quiet man. The cafeteria inside Redwood State Prison was never truly quiet, but that morning the noise had a different edge to it. A restless murmur of metal trays, low voices, and boots scraping across concrete floors. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, while a pale winter sun filtered through narrow reinforced windows, casting thin lines of gray light across the long rows of tables. New inmates learned quickly that the cafeteria was more than just a place to eat. It was where the invisible hierarchy of the prison revealed itself. Who sat where mattered, who spoke first mattered, and who stayed silent mattered even more. When Marcus Reed stepped through the steel doors that morning, most people barely noticed him. He was just another transfer inmate wearing the same orange uniform as everyone else, the fabric hanging loose over a tall but lean frame. At 34 years old, he looked calm, almost out of place in a room built on tension. His movements were slow and measured, the kind of steady pace that suggested he was observing everything without drawing attention to himself. A few inmates glanced up from their trays, giving him the same quick evaluation every newcomer received. Too quiet, too composed, probably harmless. Marcus picked up a plastic tray from the stack and moved along the serving line without saying a word. Powdered eggs, 2 slices of toast, and a cup of black coffee slid across the metal counter toward him. The routine felt mechanical, predictable, almost peaceful in its simplicity. But Redwood State Prison had a way of turning simple moments into something else entirely. Because in Block C, nothing stayed peaceful for long. Across the cafeteria, Tyler Dawson leaned back in his chair like a man who owned the room. At 6'4" and built like a wall of muscle, he didn't need to speak loudly to be noticed. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere around him. Inmates sitting nearby laughed a little too quickly at his jokes. Others avoided looking in his direction at all. Everyone in Block C understood the same unspoken rule. Tyler decided who got respect and who became entertainment. That morning his pale blue eyes drifted toward the new arrival standing in the food line. A slow grin crept across his face. Fresh transfers were always interesting. They hadn't learned the rules yet. They didn't know where to sit or who to avoid. And sometimes, if you were lucky, they provided a little amusement for the rest of the block. Marcus carried his tray toward an empty table near the far wall, moving with the same quiet confidence he had shown since entering the room. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. He simply walked as if the tension in the air didn't exist. That alone caught Tyler's attention. The big man rose from his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the concrete floor. Conversations nearby faded. A few inmates exchanged knowing looks while others leaned back slightly, preparing for the kind of moment that happened often in this place. Tyler intercepted Marcus halfway across the cafeteria, stepping directly into his path. The new inmate stopped. Not abruptly, not nervously, just calmly, as if he had expected someone might stand there. Tyler studied him for a second, head tilted, grin widening. "Well now," he said loudly enough for several tables to hear, lifting a steaming cup of coffee from Marcus's tray. "Looks like we got ourselves a quiet one." The room seemed to pause. For a brief moment, nothing moved except the faint steam rising from the cup. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, Tyler tipped the coffee forward. The dark liquid spilled across Marcus's uniform, soaking the front of the orange fabric and dripping onto the concrete floor below. A few scattered laughs rippled through the cafeteria. Someone whistled. Another inmate muttered something under his breath. But Marcus Reed didn't react. He didn't step back. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even wipe the coffee from his shirt. He simply stood there, eyes steady, breathing slow, watching Tyler with an expression so calm it felt almost unnatural in a place like Redwood State Prison. And in that silent moment, something subtle shifted in the room, though almost no one realized it yet. Because the man standing there in the coffee-stained uniform wasn't just another quiet inmate. And the bully who had just embarrassed him in front of half the block had no idea what kind of mistake he had just made. For a few seconds no one moved. The laughter that had rippled through the cafeteria faded into an uneasy silence as Marcus Reed stood there with coffee soaking into the front of his uniform. A thin trail of dark liquid dripped from the edge of the plastic tray onto the concrete floor. Tyler Dawson still held the empty cup, his grin wide as he waited for the reaction that usually followed moments like this. In Redwood State Prison, the script was always the same. The new inmate would snap back, or panic, or try to prove something in front of everyone watching. That was how the hierarchy worked. Pride pushed people into mistakes. But Marcus Reed did none of those things. He slowly lowered his tray onto the nearest empty table, careful and precise, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The movement was so calm that it confused several of the inmates watching nearby. Tyler blinked once, clearly expecting something louder. "You deaf or something?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. That coffee was not cheap. A few inmates chuckled again, though the sound was weaker now. Marcus looked down briefly at the dark stain spreading across the orange fabric of his shirt. Steam still rose faintly from it. Then he looked back up at Tyler, his expression steady and almost thoughtful. Not angry, not embarrassed, just observant. That was when a man sitting 2 tables away leaned forward slightly. Luis Ortega had spent 8 years inside Redwood and had learned how to read people quickly. Most inmates carried tension in their shoulders or their eyes. Marcus did not. His breathing was slow, his posture balanced. It was the kind of stillness Luis had only seen a few times before in men who had trained their bodies for something very specific. Luis narrowed his eyes, but said nothing. Across the room, a correctional officer near the wall shifted his stance as well. Officer Daniel Brooks had been watching the entire scene unfold from the moment Tyler stood up from his chair. Guards at Redwood usually avoided interfering in cafeteria drama unless things became uncontrollable, but Brooks noticed the same strange detail Luis had. The new inmate did not look threatened. He looked aware. Marcus picked up a napkin from the table and calmly wiped a drop of coffee from his hand. The room waited. Tyler took a step closer now, towering over him, clearly irritated that the moment was not playing out the way he wanted. "You planning to say something?" Tyler asked loudly. Marcus shook his head once. Slow and deliberate. "No," he said quietly. The single word landed in the room like a stone in still water. It was not defiant. It was not submissive either. It was simply final. Tyler's smile faded a little. He studied Marcus more carefully now, as if trying to understand why the man in front of him refused to play along with the normal prison game. Around them, the cafeteria noise slowly returned, but the tension remained suspended in the air like a storm that had not decided whether to break. Marcus reached for his tray again and moved toward the empty table near the far wall. Tyler did not stop him this time. The big man just watched him walk away, his eyes narrowing slightly as a thought crossed his mind for the first time that morning. The new inmate might not be as simple as he looked. And sometimes in a place like Redwood State Prison, the quiet ones carried the most dangerous surprises. Marcus Reed sat alone at the far table near the concrete wall, the place most inmates avoided because it offered the least protection if trouble started. The cafeteria noise slowly rebuilt itself around him. Metal trays clattered. Plastic cups scraped across tabletops. Conversations returned in low, cautious tones. But every few seconds someone glanced in his direction. News traveled fast inside Redwood State Prison, especially when something unusual happened. And what had just happened felt unusual to the men who had watched it unfold. Most inmates reacted to humiliation with anger or panic. Some tried to challenge the bully immediately. Others exploded in frustration and made their situation worse. Marcus had done neither. He simply sat down and began eating his breakfast as if nothing had happened. The eggs were cold now and the toast had hardened, but Marcus ate slowly and quietly, his movements steady and controlled. His shoulders stayed relaxed. His breathing never changed. From across the room, Tyler Dawson leaned against the table, still watching him. Something about the scene bothered him in a way he could not explain. The new inmate should have been nervous. He should have been embarrassed. Instead, he looked like a man sitting on a quiet park bench on a Sunday morning. Tyler rubbed his jaw thoughtfully, while a few members of his group whispered nearby. One of them chuckled and said something about the coffee stunt. But Tyler did not laugh this time. His eyes stayed fixed on Marcus. Luis Ortega noticed it too. The older inmate pushed his tray aside and leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus carefully. Years inside Redwood had trained Luis to recognize small details that most people missed. The way Marcus held his back straight without stiffness. The way his feet stayed planted evenly on the floor. The way his eyes moved calmly through the room without appearing nervous. Those details reminded Luis of something he had once seen on a television broadcast years ago in the prison rec room. A martial arts tournament. The fighters had moved with that same quiet balance. Luis narrowed his eyes again. It was only a feeling, but it made him curious. Near the cafeteria entrance, Officer Daniel Brooks continued his silent observation. Guards usually developed a sixth sense about tension inside the prison, and Brooks felt it now in the subtle shift of the room. Nothing dramatic had happened. No alarms had sounded. But the energy felt different, like pressure building quietly beneath the surface of the block. Brooks had worked at Redwood for 11 years. He had seen men panic, rage, and threaten. But calm was something else entirely. Calm made people unpredictable. Marcus finished the last piece of toast and wiped his hands with another napkin. The coffee stain across his shirt had begun to dry into a dark patch on the orange fabric. He glanced once toward the large wall clock above the serving counter. 8:43 in the morning. The cafeteria period would end soon. Around him, inmates began gathering their trays and moving toward the disposal bins. Chairs scraped against the concrete as the room slowly shifted toward the next routine of the day. Marcus stood up, lifting his tray with the same quiet composure he had shown all morning. For a brief moment, his eyes passed across Tyler Dawson on the other side of the room. There was no challenge in the look. No fear either. Just a calm awareness that lasted less than a second before Marcus turned toward the tray return. Tyler noticed that glance, and something in it made the corners of his grin disappear completely. Because for the first time that morning, the biggest man in Block C had the strange feeling that he had not embarrassed the new inmate at all. Instead, he had just stepped into a story that he did not fully understand yet. The cafeteria doors opened with a heavy metallic thud as the breakfast period ended and inmates began filing out toward the long gray corridors of Block C. Marcus Reed moved with the flow of the crowd, his tray already returned, his hands resting loosely at his sides. The faint coffee stain across his shirt had dried into a darker patch of fabric, but he did not seem concerned about it. Around him, men shuffled forward in worn prison boots, the echo of footsteps bouncing off concrete walls and steel railings. Redwood State Prison followed a rhythm that repeated every day. Breakfast, work assignments, yard time, count. Anyone who stayed long enough learned that the routine was the real ruler of the place. But Marcus walked through the corridor as if he had already accepted that rhythm before he ever arrived. Behind him, Luis Ortega finally stood from his table and carried his tray to the return slot. He waited until Marcus had disappeared through the cafeteria doors before turning toward the corridor as well. Curiosity had taken root in his mind. During 8 years inside Redwood, he had seen thousands of inmates arrive through those doors. The loud ones usually disappeared within weeks. The quiet ones lasted longer. But this one was different. Luis stepped into the corridor and caught up just enough to watch Marcus from several yards away. The new inmate walked with an easy balance that never looked tense. His shoulders stayed level. His steps were smooth and deliberate, each one landing with quiet precision on the concrete floor. It was not the walk of a man trying to look tough. It was the walk of someone who did not feel the need to prove anything at all. Farther down the hall, Tyler Dawson leaned against the railing of the upper-tier walkway, arms folded across his chest. He had left the cafeteria early, choosing a spot where he could watch the hallway traffic below. When Marcus emerged from the crowd, Tyler's eyes locked onto him immediately. For several seconds, he simply observed the man walking toward the cell block doors. There was still a grin on Tyler's face, but it had changed slightly. The earlier amusement had turned into something more thoughtful, something measuring. The moment Marcus passed beneath the walkway, he briefly glanced upward. The movement was quick, almost casual, yet it landed directly on Tyler's position above him. Their eyes met for half a second. Then Marcus kept walking without slowing down. Tyler straightened slightly against the railing. That small glance unsettled him more than the coffee incident had. Most inmates avoided looking directly at him during their first day in Block C. Marcus had looked without hesitation and without hostility. It felt less like defiance and more like quiet recognition. Officer Daniel Brooks noticed the exchange from the far end of the corridor where he stood beside the control desk. His years working inside Redwood had trained him to catch moments that others overlooked. The look between those two men had not been aggressive, but it carried weight. Brooks tapped a pen lightly against his clipboard as Marcus passed the desk. "Reed," he said calmly, glancing at the identification tag on the inmate's chest. Marcus stopped and turned slightly. "Yes, sir," he replied in a steady voice. Brooks studied him for a second. Up close, the calm presence felt even more noticeable. "You settling in all right so far?" the officer asked. Marcus nodded once. Yes, sir. Brooks held his gaze another moment before giving a short nod toward the hallway. Keep it that way. Marcus continued toward the cell block doors while the guard watched him go. Something about the man felt familiar, though Brooks could not place it yet. Meanwhile, Tyler Dawson remained at the railing above, still watching the quiet inmate move farther down the corridor. The big man slowly exhaled through his nose, the faint grin returning to his face. Because one thing about Redwood State Prison had always been true. If someone walked into Block C without fear, the block eventually tested that confidence. And Tyler Dawson was already planning how that test would happen. Marcus Reed followed the painted yellow line along the corridor until the heavy sliding door of cell block C opened with a mechanical buzz. The sound echoed through the concrete chamber like a signal that another routine part of the day had begun. Inside the block, the air felt cooler and heavier, filled with the layered sounds of prison life. Radios played quietly behind cell bars. Someone laughed from the upper tier. A deck of cards slapped against a metal table in the common area. Marcus stepped inside and paused just long enough to observe the space around him. 2 levels of cells lined the walls, each one stacked like narrow metal boxes with reinforced bars facing the open floor. The upper walkway wrapped around the block like a balcony, its steel railing scratched from years of restless hands gripping it. Marcus moved forward calmly, the soles of his boots landing softly on the worn concrete. His assigned cell waited halfway down the row. Cell 214. A narrow room barely 6 feet wide with a bunk, a sink, and a small steel shelf fixed to the wall. Inside, a younger inmate sat on the lower bunk flipping through a worn paperback book. He looked up as Marcus entered. The man was thin, maybe 25, with nervous eyes that scanned Marcus quickly before settling somewhere near the floor. You the new transfer? He asked quietly. Marcus nodded once. Marcus Reed. The younger man closed the book and stood. Name is Daniel Carter. Been here about 11 months. His voice carried the cautious politeness common among inmates who had learned how to avoid unnecessary attention. Marcus placed his folded blanket on the top bunk and sat down slowly. For a moment, neither man spoke. The sounds of the block drifted through the bars of the cell door. Someone called out a joke from the second tier. Another inmate complained about the breakfast. Carter finally glanced at the coffee stain still visible on Marcus's shirt. Word travels fast in here, he said carefully. People saw what happened in the cafeteria. Marcus gave a small nod, but did not respond. Carter shifted his weight uneasily. Most guys would have reacted, he continued. Tyler Dawson likes that kind of thing. Makes him look bigger. Marcus looked toward the cell bars, watching the movement of inmates across the common floor. Sometimes reacting is exactly what someone wants, he said calmly. Carter considered that for a moment. The quiet tone of Marcus's voice carried a level of certainty that felt unusual inside the block. Carter had seen plenty of men talk tough, but Marcus was not talking tough. He sounded like someone explaining a simple fact. Across the block, leaning against a metal railing on the second tier, Tyler Dawson had not stopped watching. 2 members of his group stood nearby whispering about the morning scene, but Tyler barely listened. His attention remained fixed on the new inmate sitting inside cell 214. After a moment, Tyler pushed himself away from the railing and began walking along the upper walkway. His footsteps echoed slowly above the block as he approached the staircase leading down to the main floor. Several inmates noticed the movement and quietly shifted their attention. Whenever Tyler moved with purpose, it usually meant something was about to happen. Down in cell 214, Carter heard the footsteps and glanced toward the corridor outside their bars. Looks like he is still interested, Carter muttered under his breath. Marcus followed his gaze briefly, but remained seated. His posture stayed relaxed, his hands resting loosely on his knees. A few seconds later, Tyler Dawson reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped onto the common floor of Block C. The big man walked slowly through the room while conversations faded around him. When he stopped directly outside cell 214, he rested one hand casually on the metal bars and looked inside. His eyes settled on Marcus Reed sitting calmly on the bunk. Tyler tilted his head slightly, the faint grin returning to his face. You know, he said in a relaxed voice that carried through the quiet block, most people would still be pretty upset about what happened this morning. Marcus looked up at him without hurry. His expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. For a moment, neither man spoke. The entire block seemed to pause again. because everyone watching could feel that the quiet tension between them had not disappeared. It had only begun. Tyler Dawson's hand rested loosely against the metal bars of cell 214, while the block around him slowly fell into a tense silence. Conversations that had filled the air only moments earlier faded into quiet murmurs as more inmates began to notice where Tyler had stopped. In Redwood State Prison, everyone understood that when the biggest man in Block C decided to focus his attention on someone, the entire room paid attention. Tyler leaned slightly closer to the bars, studying Marcus Reed as if he were examining something unusual. Marcus remained seated on the upper bunk, his back straight, his hands resting calmly on his knees. The faint brown stain from the morning's coffee still marked the front of his orange shirt, but he did not seem bothered by it. His breathing stayed slow and even. His eyes remained steady. Tyler let out a quiet chuckle, the sound carrying across the concrete floor. "You know something," he said casually, glancing over his shoulder at a few inmates who had gathered nearby. "Most guys come into this block trying real hard to prove they belong here." A few scattered laughs answered him, though the tone remained cautious. Tyler turned back toward the cell. "But you," he continued, pointing lightly toward Marcus with one finger, "you have not tried to prove anything at all." Marcus met his gaze without tension. "There is nothing to prove," he replied calmly. The simplicity of the answer caused a subtle ripple through the group of inmates watching from across the room. Tyler raised one eyebrow, clearly amused. "Nothing to prove," he repeated. "That is an interesting philosophy for a place like this." Behind Marcus, Daniel Carter shifted slightly on the lower bunk. He had been silent since Tyler approached, watching the exchange with careful attention. Carter had lived inside Block C long enough to understand how dangerous these moments could become. Most inmates tried to avoid attracting Tyler's interest altogether. Marcus, however, did not appear to be avoiding anything. Tyler slowly pushed away from the bars and paced a few steps across the front of the cell, his boots echoing softly against the concrete. The block remained quiet as dozens of eyes followed his movement. Finally, he stopped again and looked back toward Marcus with a faint grin. "Let me give you some friendly advice," Tyler said. "This place has its own rules. The faster you learn them, the easier your life gets." Marcus listened without interruption. Tyler gestured casually toward the open floor of the block. "One of those rules is simple. When something happens in front of everyone," he said, "people expect a response." He paused for a moment, watching Marcus carefully. "But you did not give one this morning." Marcus remained calm. "Maybe the response will come later," he said quietly. For a brief second, Tyler's grin froze. The statement had not sounded like a threat. It had sounded like a simple possibility. The kind of calm answer that left room for interpretation. Tyler studied Marcus again, trying to read the expression in his eyes. But the quiet inmate revealed nothing. The silence stretched for several seconds before Tyler finally laughed again, louder this time. "I like that," he said, shaking his head slightly. "Hey, man who thinks ahead." Around the block, a few inmates relaxed slightly as the tension seemed to ease. Tyler stepped away from the cell bars and turned toward the common area. "We will see how long that calm attitude lasts in Block C," he added over his shoulder as he walked away. The room slowly returned to its normal rhythm as conversations resumed and cards slapped against the metal table again. But inside cell 214, Daniel Carter stared at Marcus with a puzzled expression. "You talk to him like you already know something the rest of us do not," Carter said quietly. Marcus looked out through the bars toward the open floor of the block where Tyler Dawson now stood surrounded by his group again. For a moment Marcus said nothing. Then he spoke in the same steady voice he had used all morning. "Sometimes," he said softly, "people reveal more about themselves than they realize." Carter followed Marcus's gaze across the room. Tyler Dawson laughed with his group as if nothing unusual had happened. But Marcus continued watching him with calm attention, because the quiet tension between them had not disappeared at all. It had simply moved into a new stage, one that everyone inside Block C would soon begin to notice. The atmosphere inside Block C never truly returned to normal after Tyler Dawson walked away from cell 214. Conversations resumed and cards slapped against the metal table again, but something subtle had shifted beneath the routine noise of the prison block. Men who had watched the exchange earlier kept glancing toward the quiet inmate sitting behind the bars of his cell. Word had already begun to move through the block in low whispers. The new guy had not reacted the way people expected, and in a place like Redwood State Prison, anything unusual quickly became the center of attention. Marcus Reed remained seated on the upper bunk for several minutes after Tyler left. His posture stayed relaxed, his hands resting loosely together as he observed the movement across the floor. The block followed its usual rhythm. Two inmates argued over a card game. Another group leaned against the wall near the staircase, trading stories about their work assignments. From the upper tier, someone played music through a small radio that buzzed softly with static. Marcus watched everything without appearing to focus on anything in particular. Daniel Carter finally broke the silence inside the cell. "You realize he is not finished with you," Carter said quietly. Marcus turned his head slightly. "No," he replied calmly. "He is not." Carter leaned forward on the lower bunk, lowering his voice. "Tyler likes an audience. That thing earlier in the cafeteria was just a preview." Marcus nodded once as if the statement confirmed something he already expected. Carter studied him carefully. "You do not seem worried." Marcus gave a faint smile that lasted only a moment. "Worry does not solve problems," he said. Across the block, Tyler Dawson stood near the metal table where his group usually gathered. He laughed with two men beside him while shuffling a deck of cards across the surface. From a distance, it looked like he had already forgotten about the new inmate entirely. But every so often his eyes drifted towards cell 214. He was watching more carefully than he wanted people to notice. A tall inmate beside him leaned closer and whispered something that made Tyler grin again. A few minutes later, Tyler tossed the deck of cards onto the table and straightened up. "Come on," he said casually to the two men standing nearby. "Let us stretch our legs." The three of them began walking slowly across the block floor. Their pace was unhurried but deliberate, weaving through the scattered groups of inmates until they stopped again near the open exercise area along the far wall. A few sets of pull-up bars had been bolted into the concrete there years earlier, giving inmates a place to pass time between scheduled activities. Tyler grabbed one of the bars and lifted himself up easily, his arms moving with practiced strength. Several inmates glanced over as he continued the motion again and again, each repetition smooth and controlled. The display drew attention the way he intended. Strength was a kind of currency inside Redwood. When Tyler dropped back to the floor, he looked across the room toward cell 214. His voice carried just enough to reach the nearby cells. "Funny thing about this place," he said loudly, stretching his shoulders. "You learn pretty fast who can handle pressure and who cannot." The men around him chuckled lightly. Inside the cell, Daniel Carter heard the comment and shook his head. "He is setting something up," Carter muttered. Marcus stood slowly from the upper bunk and stepped closer to the bars. His eyes moved across the block toward the exercise area where Tyler Dawson now stood with his arms folded. Their gazes met once again across the open floor. Tyler tilted his head slightly and gestured toward the pull-up bars with one hand, as if inviting a response without saying the words directly. The block grew quieter again as several inmates noticed the silent exchange. Marcus watched the gesture for a moment, then rested one hand lightly against the cell bars. His expression remained calm, thoughtful, almost patient, because the quiet tension that had begun that morning was slowly building into something everyone inside Block C could now feel approaching. Marcus Reed stood quietly behind the bars of cell 214, one hand resting lightly against the cool metal while the noise of Block C softened into a cautious silence. Across the room, Tyler Dawson still stood beside the pull-up bars, his broad shoulders rising and falling slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. Several inmates had already stopped what they were doing to watch the silent exchange. In Redwood State Prison, people learned quickly when something important was unfolding. Tyler tilted his head again and lifted one arm, gripping the bar above him before pulling himself upward with smooth strength. The motion was easy for him, almost casual, and a few men nearby nodded with quiet approval. Displays like that mattered inside the block. Strength was a language everyone understood. When Tyler dropped back to the floor, he wiped his hands together and looked directly towards cell 214. "You ever exercise, Reed?" he called across the room, his voice loud enough to reach the far wall. A few inmates chuckled under their breath as the attention of the entire block turned toward the quiet newcomer. Inside the cell, Daniel Carter shifted uneasily. "You do not have to answer that," he muttered softly. But Marcus had already stepped forward. He moved slowly toward the open cell door, as if he had been expecting the moment all along. The correctional officer stationed at the far desk glanced up, but did not interfere. As long as nothing serious happened, the guards usually allowed inmates to settle their own tensions. Marcus walked out into the open floor of Block C with the same calm pace he had carried since breakfast. The room grew noticeably quieter. As he approached the exercise area, Tyler watched him closely, the faint grin returning to his face. "Look at that," Tyler said to the men around him. The quiet man finally decided to take a walk. Marcus stopped a few feet away from the pull-up bars. He glanced briefly at the equipment, then back at Tyler. "You asked a question," Marcus said evenly. "So I came to answer it." Tyler chuckled. "Fair enough." He stepped aside and gestured toward the bar mounted overhead. "Let us see what you have got then." Several inmates leaned forward where they stood, sensing the moment building in front of them. Marcus reached up and wrapped his hands around the bar. His grip settled naturally as he lifted himself upward in one smooth motion. There was no strain in his shoulders, no sudden effort. The movement looked balanced and controlled, almost effortless. He lowered himself and repeated the motion again. Then again. The rhythm remained steady and precise. A few men nearby exchanged surprised looks as the count continued without pause. Tyler's grin slowly faded while he watched. This was not the awkward attempt of someone trying to impress the block. Marcus moved with the calm focus of someone who had spent years training his body to follow exact patterns. After several repetitions, Marcus released the bar and landed lightly on the concrete floor. He stepped back and rested his hands loosely at his sides. For a moment, nobody spoke. The quiet in the block felt heavier now, filled with new curiosity. Tyler studied him carefully, his expression thoughtful instead of amused. "Interesting," he said after a pause. "You move like you have done this before." Marcus met his gaze calmly. "I have trained for a long time," he replied. Tyler narrowed his eyes slightly. "Training for what exactly?" The room seemed to lean closer to the answer. Marcus remained silent for a moment, then spoke in the same steady voice that had never changed since morning. "Discipline," he said simply. Several inmates looked at each other in confusion. The words sounded almost philosophical inside a place like Redwood State Prison. Tyler let out a short laugh, but his eyes stayed sharp. Because the calm confidence in Marcus Reed had not disappeared. If anything, it had become even more obvious to everyone watching. And somewhere in the back of Tyler Dawson's mind, a quiet realization began to form. The quiet man in Block C might not be the easy target he first appeared to be. The quiet that followed Marcus Reed's final words lingered across Block C like a weight settling over the room. The inmates standing near the exercise bars slowly returned to their conversations, but the tone had changed. Curiosity had replaced amusement. The new man had not tried to challenge anyone. He had not tried to impress anyone either. Yet somehow the calm way he carried himself had forced everyone to look twice. Tyler Dawson stood in the same place for several seconds after Marcus stepped back from the bar. His arms folded across his chest while his eyes studied the quiet inmate more carefully than before. Something about the balance in Marcus's movements bothered him. It reminded him of something he had once seen years ago on a television in the prison rec room. Professional fighters moved like that. Controlled, measured, efficient. Tyler finally broke the silence with a short laugh. "Discipline," he repeated with a grin that sounded lighter than it felt. "That is a pretty serious word for this place." A few men nearby chuckled politely, though the laughter faded quickly. Marcus did not respond. He simply stepped away from the exercise area and began walking back toward cell 214 with the same steady pace he had used all morning. The crowd parted slightly to let him pass. It was not fear that made them move. It was curiosity. People inside Redwood had learned to read signals, and the quiet confidence in Marcus Reed was sending a message they could not quite understand yet. On the upper-tier walkway, Luis Ortega leaned against the railing watching everything below. The older inmate shook his head slowly while a faint smile crossed his face. "Interesting," he muttered to himself. He had seen enough in his years inside the system to recognize a rare kind of presence. Some men tried to look strong. Others tried to look dangerous. Marcus Reed did neither. He simply looked prepared. Back near the control desk, Officer Daniel Brooks had also been observing the exchange from a distance. When Marcus passed by again, Brooks watched him carefully, the same faint sense of recognition stirring in the back of his mind. Later that afternoon, Brooks would check the intake records for the new inmate, something he rarely bothered to do unless something about a person stood out. And when he did, he would discover a detail that explained the quiet confidence everyone had noticed. Because before Marcus Reed ever walked through the gates of Redwood State Prison, he had spent nearly 20 years training in competitive martial arts. He had traveled across the country competing in national-level taekwondo tournaments. His record included multiple championship titles and a reputation for calm precision that had made his name well known in professional circles. But none of that history had been mentioned when he arrived at Redwood. Inside the prison, he was simply inmate number 88421. Back in Block C, Marcus stepped into cell 214 and sat down on the lower bunk. Daniel Carter looked at him with wide eyes. "You handled that better than anyone I have seen," Carter said quietly. Marcus gave a small shrug. Sometimes patience tells people more than anger ever could. Across the block, Tyler Dawson remained near the exercise bars, watching the quiet inmate disappear behind the metal door of his cell. The grin had faded from his face now, replaced by something closer to curiosity. Because for the first time since Marcus Reed arrived that morning, Tyler Dawson had begun to understand something important. The quiet man he had tried to embarrass in the cafeteria might not be weak at all. In fact, he might be someone who had spent a lifetime mastering control. And in a place like Redwood State Prison, control was far more dangerous than anger.